Everything looks better with a dram in your hand.
It's quite simple. If America's whiskey industry was foundering, then the whole world would feel it. American distillers get one use of their barrels, and then that's it, by law. Once they've performed their vital role, then these whiskey-infused barrels voyage out across the world to be excellent maturation vessels used by winemakers and distillers everywhere. But what of the American whiskey itself? Very popular and firmly beloved at home, but still something of a mystery to many Scotch drinkers. Well, I'm joined now by brand ambassador to one of the oldest hands in the American whiskey industry, Matt Neal of Uncle Nearest Distillers. Matt, welcome.
Nice to be here.
How are you coping on this sunny bank holiday in lockdown?
This sunny bank holiday in lockdown is absolutely amazing. Obviously, I've recently shaved my head, and I'm ginger, so I'm dodging from shadow to shadow on this beautifully sunny day.
Fantastic. Now, my confession: I spent a very long part of my life not being a Scotch whiskey drinker. It was only an epiphany with one particular malt that got me really interested in the whole thing and to sort of where I'm sitting now. And I haven't yet had that epiphany with American whiskey, but you have. So could you tell us how it happened?
Yeah, completely. Well, firstly, I like the word epiphany. I basically came through bars and then went into working sort of the event scene through London. So I've sort of had love affairs with nearly every single type of spirit except Sambuca. I've never been able to find a decent Sambuca. If anybody wants to suggest one, at Matt Neal AVB, you can send a suggestion. But so I've always been aware of pretty much most spirits and sort of how to use them, and realised I sort of like certain flavour profiles. But with American whiskey, especially, I mean, we used to make old fashions out of Woodford Reserve, and it would be shots of, yellow label Four Roses at bars where your mates were working. The one whiskey or the one story that got me was my brother was an actor, and when he was doing a Sam Shepard play on the West End, and my friend was working at the bar, so I used to go in there and drink during the performance and meet up with him afterwards. And I think it was the opening night or the second night, I was in there drinking in the bar, and he came out after he'd done it, and he was like, "Have you tasted this? The lead gave me this bottle of whiskey as a sort of present." I was like, "Nope, I have no idea what it is." Had a weird name called Michter's, and it was Michter's toasted barrel finish, the first batch. Okay. Basically, the quick skinny on it, and I know the Michter's rep, so he'll probably have a go at me for getting this wrong. But the upshot is it's a bourbon that's been aged in a new barrel and then finished in a second new barrel that has been toasted. So it's been charred using indirect heat. And it just tasted completely different. It was beautiful, but it wasn't the actual quality or how delicious the spirit was that got me. It was the fact that it was different to anything I'd tasted before. It was the first premium American whiskey I'd tasted, and it sort of woke me up to thinking, this category is a lot bigger than I think it is.
Right, yeah.
It's the same with Scotch whiskey. You drink your Speysides, your 12-year-olds, a couple of smoky ones, and then it's always one bottle that you think, this is a lot bigger than I thought. And so then I went in and I started drinking as much as I could, sort of, that I hadn't tasted before. A couple of shots of Sazerac 18 later, a bottle of Smooth Ambler, 7-year-old rye, and a Blanton's Gold, and that was me, done. I was like, this is definitely something I'd like to spend my time researching, like I'd done for Scotch whiskey.
And it seems, the ease with which you're dropping some of the names there, it sort of shows how big that world is. And just because I haven't yet found the one that opened my eyes doesn't mean I should stop searching, because there are a lot of unturned stones to look under.
100%. And one of the things about American whiskey, even since I've been sort of interested in it and working in it, the innovation is becoming massive, like barrel finishing, port finished whiskey, Madeira finished whiskies, tequila finished whiskies. There is a lot of finishing going on. There is a lot of playing about with mash bills. There is a lot of very, very new distilleries cropping up everywhere. It's akin to Irish whiskey, whereas it's just this sort of explosion now.
Yeah. And again, sort of hearing things that Scotch drinkers might latch onto there, the different finishes, the inventiveness that creates different categories. One thing that you may have noticed I was sort of tiptoeing around in my introduction was I was saying American whiskey, which to a lot of people, they'll think, oh, well, that's just bourbon, isn't it? So Uncle Nearest kind of both is and isn't a bourbon. So could you bring us a little clarity on that?
It's an exceedingly geeky clarity, so I apologise for apologise for anybody listening. Tennessee whiskey there's been distillation in Tennessee as long as there has been pretty much most of the places in the United States, and there's been bourbon, whiskey, rye being made the whole country through for hundreds of years. And in 1964, the government decided that they wanted to protect this category, make it a truly American spirit, especially bourbon. So they came out with a set of laws governing what is a bourbon, what is an American whiskey, what is a rye whiskey, what is a American single malt. And in 1964, these laws contained a couple of sentences for Tennessee whiskey, which was, there is Tennessee whiskey. That was it. And so it was like, okay, well, that's fantastic. But nobody really minded. If you want to drink Tennessee whiskey, you can find it. In 1970, the government decided that you had to label your whiskey to the closest denominator. So if you were Tennessee whiskey, you had to either be an American whiskey or a bourbon. That's how you'd have to register it. This carried on until 2013, when the governor of Tennessee, in a bid to force a law federally, categorized Tennessee whiskey as it's known sort of today, which is it has to be distilled, bottled, and aged in Tennessee, right, and it has to go through the Lincoln County process, which is a filtration through sugar maple charcoal before going into the barrel. So off the still before going into the barrel, which basically changes the flavor, but doesn't add anything to the spirit, but it rounds it out, gives the wood more impact on the spirit, but it definitely gives it a distinctive flavor. So he put in these laws, wanted it to go federally. It didn't. So even though we have legislation for Tennessee whiskey still have to register themselves as either American whiskey or bourbon, depending which one they fall closest to. So the basic upshot is we are both bourbon or American whiskey and Tennessee whiskey.
And the Lincoln County process is pretty central to that. So this is supposedly something actually developed by Nathan Uncle Nearest himself. Yeah. And even as it goes, he may have taught the tricks to a young Jack Daniels as well.
Yes.
So yeah. I imagine this is still very central to the Uncle Nearest brand, is the Lincoln County filtration.
100%. The story is massively central to our brand, and it's been verified as we go along. Our CEO, Fawn Weaver, basically the whiskey wouldn't exist without the story. I heard this story whilst reading a newspaper. She's a writer and she was looking for something to write about. So she then went to Tennessee to research this story, started gathering all the facts, found out that it was a slave called Nearest Green, or Uncle Nearest, who taught Jack Daniel how to distill when he was a boy and had run away from home and was living on this farm. As she found this story out, she met the Green family and fell in love with this story, and it was suggested to her that if she wanted to honor Uncle Nearest, that she would make a whiskey bearing his name. So many years later, we have no book yet, but we have a whiskey and I have a job. So I'm really, really happy. But one of the things about this story was she always said that if it was going to be a story of hate, if it was going to be a story about exploitation, she would research it, but she wouldn't write about it. And as she did her research, she found out the friendship that developed between Jack Daniel and Uncle Nearest was just that. It was a friendship. So when Jack Daniel got enough money and bought his first distillery, he hired Uncle Nearest as a free man after the Emancipation Proclamation to be his first head of whiskey, and they developed Jack Daniel together. to have such a wonderful untold story, or unpublicized story at the center of your brand, it's very synonymous with what we do.
And it's wonderful that now Uncle Nearest does have a brand to represent that story and his achievement, and sort of bringing a new way, a whole new technique of it's not actually part of the distillation, but it's part of the whole process, making whiskey that really does taste very different because it's been introduced. So it's nice to have that brand out there now, and others that followed it.
Yeah, completely. It's great that Tennessee whiskey. We got in quite early. It's great to see that Tennessee whiskey is more than just one product. And weirdly enough, I've got friends who also work for Brown-Forman. Talking to them as well, they welcome the expansion of the category, because too often people will just say, "Oh, we'll discount things because it's the only one." And this diversification of the category, people playing around, new people coming onto the block and messing around with processes, aging, different chars, mash bills, is only ever good.
It's also significant that that Nearest Green was the first African American master distiller. But how many others have been able to follow the trail that he blazed?
It's immensely significant that he was the first master distiller, and to have Jack Daniel recognize him as such, and that put information to him in their distillery is an amazing feat. Who has followed? I have no idea about the breadth and the depth of it, especially seeing as though it's such an explosive market. The stuff we do know is that immediately following his retirement in 1884, 3 of his sons moved over to the new Daniel distillery and worked there with Jack. And there is a photo of Eli with his arm around Jack Daniel in one of their company photos. And there hasn't been a moment in history where one of the Nearest Green families hasn't worked for JD. Even to this day. In reverse, we have a descendant of Jack Daniel working for us. So the legacy there was immediate. The importance of this, I think it's no matter what's happened in the past, I think the importance of this now is palpable. I mean, we have an all-female executive team. Fawn, our CEO, is an African American, and she's one of the first to own an American whiskey company. And as whiskey expands and hits new drinkers, people are drinking it younger, ethnic minorities, women. It's becoming a growth spirit, and people are being and to have a company that is being made, and it's not just us, there are others who are being made by a whole breadth of different people, just makes it more inclusive.
So let's talk a little about the actual spirit itself, especially with reference to Scotch whiskey, which is something that us lot are quite familiar with. What are some of the main similarities and differences between, Scottish and American whiskies, and then some of the particular differences with Uncle Nearest spirit?
Absolutely. Well, they're both wet and alcoholic. And they both have to be bottled over 40% or 80 proof, both aged in oak. So they both share those wooded aged flavors, and they both fall under the broader category of whiskey. So they have to be made from grains. But after that, the differences are, there are more differences than similarities when it comes to legislation and how they're actually made. Where to start? I think the biggest difference probably will be the grain used. So Scotch, obviously, they can use different grains, but predominantly most people will be used to single malts or a blend of a certain grain and a single malt. In the States, they're very used to mixtures of different grains in mash bills, and the predominant one, especially in Uncle Nearest, is corn. So instead of using malted barley, we use corn, and straight away there's a difference. Corn is unbelievably fatty. It's a fatty, sweet sort of buttery spirit. And so you get a huge mouthfeel. And for this reason, even though it comes off the stills before aging at a lower percentage than a lot of scotches, we tend to use column stills, because the extra height actually strips some of these fatty acids and lipids away, giving you a cleaner spirit. So you can use pot stills. I've tasted a couple and they're absolutely beautiful, but one wrong move and it comes out tasting like the yellow butter that you put on popcorn.
Oh boy, that's going to have only a very specific appeal, I think.
100%. So a lot of American whiskies will use column stills or only a small percentage of pot still. But what it does is it definitely makes bourbon in generally sweeter and more the corn flavors, more buttery, more sort of pronounced on the fore palate. The next one would be 100% is the barrels that you touched on before. So we use new oak barrels and have to. In fact, as soon as it comes out of the first new oak barrel, that's considered our aging process over. No matter if it's finished, no matter what, it has to be that new oak barrel.
So aging does not add any time on to the maturation?
No. So basically, as soon as it comes out of the first barrel, that's the number you can put on the bottle. Interesting. Yeah. So now I'd have to double check. I don't even think it's mentioned if that's the same in American whiskey categories but that was really interesting to me. So that's one of the things. But age dependent anyway. With American whiskey, that new oak barrel adds so much flavor so quickly, and a very specific flavor as well. It's very vanilla, bit spicy when it's in there a bit longer, but it's very, very forward, a lot of flavor, lots of woods, lots of sort of baking spice, and that's heavily on the palate in the from the new oak. And then Tennessee's hot as the center of the sun as well. So you've got the climate, which it's pretty extreme. The liquid gets sucked deep into that new oak and spat back out, and you're getting even more flavor from it that way. So everything to do with bourbon is about extracting that flavor pretty quickly. At Uncle Nearest, we try and proof down. So we try and lose more alcohol than we do water, and actually go down in percentage. But there are a lot of companies that they will have certain barrels that go up in percentage once they hit the barrels, and that's a problem that not many scotches have.
No,
So what you end up with is a spirit that's pretty much reaching its peak around about anywhere between 6 and 15 years old. So it's quick. And with Scotch is, with the used barrels and even the new barrels, it's layering that flavor over decades. So what bourbon has at the front palate and all that bursting flavor and that hits you in the face and that you can taste right up to the back of your teeth, Scotch has in subtlety and length and layering. And for me, a Scotch is brilliant between 15 and 25. So you've got that as the main difference. So you've got a sweet, quickly aged, rambunctious spirit that hits you in the palate and leaves your mouth watering and gives you what they call a Tennessee hug on the way down.
I'll say that my mouth is actually watering right now as we speak.
And with Scotch, you've got something that is very much mid-palate. You get a sort of initial sweetness on your tongue and that you can taste. If it's finished in a sherry barrel, that's more forward. But then it rolls over your tongue to the back palate, and then you get that fruity sort of gentle or smoky, if you've gone for it, finish that lasts as long as you like. And I think that's equated into the different flavors from the different countries. Americans love their Ben & Jerry's ice cream. They love their sodas, their barbecue. Everything's exploding with flavor and really, really full on. And Scotch drinkers and us over here, we like our nuance. So they call us fish and chips, but we like we have a gentler, more easy palate when it comes to accepting spirits.
So it sounds like maybe one of the keys of getting into bourbon and Tennessee whiskey drinking is don't expect it to fill exactly the same role as Scotch. I see on the shelf behind you, you've got a good selection of bottles from both sides of the ocean. So will you find yourself going for the American whiskies at a certain time or the Scotches for a different time?
Yeah, and I think most of your viewers will also have that sort of time difference. You're not going to wake up in the morning and go, oh, it's a bank holiday, I'm going to have a barbecue. I'm going to start my day at midday with an Optimal. That's your taste buds done.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love Islay whiskies at night, and I 100% love the Bravery range. For me, if you're going to start with American whiskey, it's usually a more of a sort of afternoon, but sort of daytime sort of drinking thing. You've got something that's sweet, sort of thick on the palate, heavy, mixes well, and it's sort of, as you said, it makes your mouth water. You've got toffee, you've got the baking spice. They usually use rye in it as well to dry out, as a flavouring grain to balance out the actual the corn. So it gives it a little bit of a spicy, dry length. And so you'll end up drinking whiskey. For me, bourbon's very much a sort of a sort of all night sort of like, we'll start quite early, mix it with soda. You can play around with it, having it in cocktails. And then by the time the sun starts going down, you'll either move on to your well-aged sort of single barrel bourbons, or you'll start moving onto your scotches. The stuff that you physically can't drink quickly. You should be savouring the finish. But you move on to your. For me, I'm a big fan of the space side. You'll move on to your sort of like, for me, the Glenfiddich 18 and stuff like that with the nice finish. The Balvenie 21's an absolute for me, the Balvenie 21's an absolute joy to have. But it's one of those. It slows your evening down, and then by the time you end up on the Port Ascaig or any of the elements of Islay, you're there going, and I'm done.
Sounds like a pretty good plan for a good evening, actually.
It would be fantastic. Now all I need to do is stop my addiction for auction websites and.
Well, now, so I imagine that being in the UK and a few thousand miles away from the distillery, we don't get the full range of Uncle Nearest whiskies here. But what can we get our hands on?
At the moment, available over here is our key product, which is the 1856, which is a non-chill filtered 8 to 13-year-old 50% or 100 proof whiskey, Tennessee whiskey, and we go into the barrels pretty low, so we go in at about 55% or 110% proof down. Comes out at about 52 to 56, 57. So we don't put much water into the actual bottle, and it's there as a key. So it's our key product. It's just full of flavor, full of toffee, full of vanilla, baking spice, very, very big, very warming, absolutely amazing. And that's the one that's available here. Just before lockdown, we were meant to be bringing out the 1884. I have a bottle just on the back, which is... nice. Which I smuggled over. And this is a small batch, younger, zestier, watered down to, I think it's 93 proof. So 46.5%. It's only dividing by 2, and I can't do it in my head, which is why I became a bartender. But it's distinctly the same spirit, but you can taste the difference. And this is meant to be being released as we speak. But I have a feeling it will be coming out hopefully winter or maybe next year. And then we have a single barrel, which is always over 11 years old. And that's exactly what it says. It's well-aged. It's harder work. It's slower. It makes you work for the flavor that you're drinking. It's not something you go, oh, that was nice. It's something you sit down and go, wow, okay, I'm gonna let this roll over my palate and go through. And that is available in the country through the British Bourbon Society, and should be entering the country hopefully in the next sort of 8 to 9 months. So we should have the whole range over here.
Fingers crossed. It sounds completely delightful. And,
it is.
Yeah, and while lockdown is still on, are there ways of interacting with Uncle Nearest during the lockdown?
Yeah, 100%. I'm always happy to answer questions or anything via Instagram or Facebook. My handle is at Matt Neal, MATTNEAL, AVB, so alcohol by volume. And so I'm sort of the contact here. We have a Facebook page for Uncle Nearest, which is Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey. And our CEO is pretty active on that, actually. I have no idea where she finds all her energy. It's a direct way of contacting the distillery and the people involved. And also, they're pretty active on Instagram as well, at Uncle Nearest. I think weirdly, the last thing as well is there is a fan site,
Okay.
which is an unofficial fan site, which is run by a gentleman named Dan. And he's created a Facebook page called Uncle Nearest and Other Premium Whiskies, other American premium whiskies, which he invented just because he liked drinking Uncle Nearest. No, but it's nice to see that it's in the year or so we've been in this country. It's the spirit is gaining a lot of popularity.
Excellent. I mean, I'm going to take the first opportunity I get to give it a go because, as I said, I'm still waiting for that Bourbon moment, but I think you've helped propel me several steps in that direction. I'm ready to experience it as you described, and maybe not expect it to be the same thing as a Scotch, to have a slightly different role. Absolutely.
Well, just as a sort of caveat to new bourbon drinkers and people trying to get into it, one of the things about American whiskey is they have a flavoring grain. So you have your corn, bourbon especially has its corn, and then it will have another grain added to it to balance out that flavor. A lot of the time it's rye. This gives a spicy, and when I say spicy, I mean baking spice, dry, sort of fruity edge to it. And they end up tasting a bit more woody and spicy. And that's stunning. But rye is a grain that Scotch drinkers aren't massively used to. And so it can taste like extra AVB, extra alcohol. The other most common flavoring grain is wheat.
Okay, wheat is a flavouring grain.
Yeah, so what wheat gives it is a subtle sort of biscuity quality. Like as in the ones that I know use wheat are Weller and Maker's Mark, and there's a couple over there. And that gives a soft, really, really nice entry into it as well. So if you're looking to get into whiskey, it's always nice to try and find one. Our flavouring grain is rye, and we have malted barley in there for the enzymes. Find something that is nicely wooded and sort of nicely aged in, say, Uncle Nearest. Then go for something that has a wheat flavouring grain like Wathans or am I thinking Wathans? Well, then Weller and Maker's Mark, and there's loads out there that are absolutely amazing, and you don't have to break your bank.
Perfect. Well, I have to say, Matt Neal, it's been a real delight to talk about bourbon / Tennessee / both whiskey with you today.
Thank you.
Definitely be looking out for bottles of Uncle Nearest, and thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure. It's great to be on here, and it's really nice that during lockdown there's programs like this out there that can keep people engaged, and I mean the amount of education that is now floating around is amazing. So thank you for doing this.
That's the hope, that we leave people be a little more informed than when they came in.
That's perfect. Well, I'm more informed after watching your previous episodes, so that's fantastic. We're also, Uncle Nearest are also doing, or myself, I'm also doing a Whiskey Wednesday, which is we're inviting brand ambassadors, sort of bartenders and distillers onto a show very much like this, but done live, that, just for education and to push forward my knowledge in different spirit categories as well. So they talk about their products. We had JJ Corey on, an Irish Bonders, whiskey bonder, which is I knew nothing about, but Nima, who's their brand ambassador, Neve, who was their brand ambassador, was phenomenal, and the whiskey's delightful. So if you want to get involved in that, you can go to my Facebook page or our Facebook page or my Instagram page and get involved in just watching more stuff about whiskey.
Awesome.